right, we are thrilled to welcome in Amy Trask, CBS sports analyst, former CEO of the Raiders. Amy, thank you for joining us today.
I am thrilled, honored, delighted, or as my mom would say, tickled pink to join you. Thanks so much for having me.
As a former CEO, why are you so positive and cheery all the time and always saying hi to people on Twitter? That was your question, Sam. I'm sorry, but you're so positive all the time.
Well, I do have my moments. And by the way, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to be firm and strong and, a leader and yet also say hi to people.
I love it. That's great. I was really excited for this. We've had some decent guests here. I might be most excited for this, though. I'm sure you get a million questions about Al Davis and just that, the history and, just everything that he's brought to the table from a football standpoint. But our generation knows him as the guy that likes the dude who runs 4.2 at the combine, right? So
right.
Can you expound upon that? Like, what did Al Davis mean to football for our younger listeners? What is his real legacy besides the guy who likes fast guys at the combine?
Well, some of the people listening will be Raider fans, others will not, and that's putting it mildly. There will be some who are listening who really don't like the Raiders. There will be some people listening who appreciate and respect and liked Al Davis, and there will be some who didn't. But I think if we're being intellectually honest, one thing on which everyone can agree is this was a man who was so far ahead of his times in terms of hiring in a diverse and inclusive manner. He hired without regard to race, gender, ethnicity, or any other individuality, which has no bearing whatsoever on whether one can do a job. And I was a beneficiary of that vision. He hired me, and boy, oh boy, when I say this, I realize some of your listeners weren't even born when I was hired. He hired me in the early part of the mid-'80s. And that was a time when issues of women in sports and women in the NFL weren't even issues. They weren't topics. They weren't on anyone's radar screen, and he just didn't care.
It's actually incredible how far ahead of the game that is, because that's a topic now, right? How the NFL is doing in terms of bringing women into the game, whether it's coaches, whether it's executives. Sarah Thomas is an official. Beth Mowins is calling games now. How do you think the league is doing in terms of improving that area?
Well, you're right. He was far, far, far ahead of his time. Look, there has been improvement since I joined. And again, I'll note, I joined the league decades and decades ago in the 80s. And when I walked into my first NFL team owners meeting, I was the only woman in the room. Now there's others. Jeannie Bunk with the Los Angeles Chargers, a very, very, very senior, magnificent executive there. Hannah Gordon with the San Francisco 49ers, an executive there who does a tremendous job. So there are other women now. And I'm going to answer your question, therefore, in two ways. A, it still isn't an overwhelming number, and it still isn't far enough in terms of race or gender or ethnicity or any of those individualities, which have no bearing on whether one can do a job. But it is far better than when I joined. So has there been progress since I joined the league? Yes. Is there more progress to be made? Of course.
How do you think that the league, I think the biggest problem with that stuff is the league is trapped in this like old boys network, this cycle of just repeat hires and, a very established pathway that they just keep falling into. How do you think that they break that cycle well? Because they've kind of dabbled at it, right? The Rooney Rule, and now they're incentivizing teams to develop, quote unquote, minority candidates or things like that. Have you got suggestions? Where do you think they should go?
Some teams are doing things on their own without regard to league mandate. And, there are a number of teams, but two that come to my mind are the San Francisco 49ers and the Los Angeles Rams. They are developing programs where people can join young and work their way up through what's referred to as a pipeline, if you will. You don't just wake up one day and walk in and say, I want to be a GM or I want to be a head coach. You've got to work your way into those positions. And those are two teams which are doing good jobs of allowing people to join at a young age and work their way up. And I think we'll see more and more of that as time goes on. Look, men, I think there should be such a thing. I hope there is ultimately such a thing as business Darwinism. And this goes beyond sports. This is to business in general. If you are a business and you don't hire without regard to any of those individualities I mentioned, race, gender, ethnicity, umpteen other differences, ultimately you should fail, because by definition, you are eliminating vast swaths of incredibly talented individuals. So if there is business Darwinism, the businesses which hire without regard to those issues should be the businesses that best succeed. And, the other thing I'll add to this, and it's the biggest misconception about Al, I'll turn to that in a minute, is diverse opinions, diverse thoughts, diverse ideas, diverse thought processes are so important to businesses. Echo chambers aren't healthy. Disagreement is good. You pointed out at the beginning that I say hi, and I like to be cheery with people and say hi. By the way, you can say hi in a non-cheery manner sometimes. But the fact is, I do believe that disagreement is healthy and disagreement can be productive. The biggest misconception about Al is that you couldn't disagree with him. If that were the case, I would have been fired roughly 2 weeks into my job. He walked into a room where I was sitting with a coworker, and he lit into that man like a velociraptor would rip into flesh, is how I imagined it at the time. I mean, he just tore into this guy. And after a bit of time, I said, "Excuse me, you're wrong." And I'd only been employed by the team about 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks. And I won't bore you with the whole story. I wrote about it. But the fact is, after we argued back and forth, and I pointed out to him that if the facts on which he were basing his conclusion were accurate, well, then it would be a fair conclusion. But he was basing his decision, his conclusion, on inaccurate data. And we screamed at one another. And after a while, he said to me, "Oh, okay, I got it. And we moved right along. And that set the tone for an almost 30-year working relationship in which we disagreed more than we agreed.
That's awesome. I love it. I was going to say, is that part of your ability to earn respect? Just because again, I agree with the echo chamber thing. How much do you think that is prevalent in businesses, football teams, team building and all that stuff, the echo chamber versus the idea of just having diverse opinions and ideas to try to get to the greater good? Everybody, the ultimate just win, baby, right? That's what you're all trying to get to.
Right. Well, my observation is that it is prevalent in a lot of businesses, not simply in sports, and that the best businesses and the healthiest businesses are the ones which encourage disagreement. Now, one thing I always knew and I understood from that first disagreement through 30 years of disagreement, if you're going to disagree, bring your facts, bring your information, bring your data. Don't just disagree to be disagreeable. Disagree if you believe your position is right and do your best to explain it. Now, look, ultimately, I understood Al owned the team. I did not. So his word was going to be the final word. I would do all I could to convince him that he was wrong. And as I said, we disagreed more than we agreed. But at the end of the day, he got to make the decision because he owned the business. And it was then my job to effectuate that decision as best I could.
Disagree and commit, as we like to say here at PFF.
Right, that's our boss Neil Hornsby's mantra. That's what he goes with. As far as I can tell, you got your start with the Raiders, essentially cold calling them for an unpaid internship way back in the day. Were they your first call, or did you almost live like a whole separate life in a law firm somewhere, or working for a bank, or was there another option that didn't pick up the phone?
No, it was my first call when I was in graduate school. And I want to quickly note, because I did do an unpaid internship for the team, and I recognize how fortunate I was in that regard. Not everyone had the luxury, if you will, of being able to pick up the phone and say, right, I will be an intern and you don't have to pay me. And by the way, that's exactly how the conversation went. When I was in grad school, I picked up on the fact that others were having what they called internships and externships. I didn't understand what the difference was. I don't think I understand it to this day. But I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I picked up the phone and I called the Raiders and I said, I'd like to be an intern. They connected me with a gentleman who said, what's that? And I said, well, I'll work for you and you won't pay me. And he said, come on down. But again, I recognize how fortunate I was that I had the luxury. Now, the good news is, kids today, they pay interns. Not in the olden days, and I did have the good fortune of not having to be paid, and I recognize that good fortune. But today, they pay you. So make that phone call.
So if that was your first phone call, you're like, I need an internship, I'm calling the Raiders. Were you already a football nut? Where did that come from?
I fell in love with the game of football in junior high. And I didn't come from a family of football nuts, to use your term. My family watched the Super Bowl every year. They weren't, nobody was usually home on Sundays. They were out and about. And I was the one who wanted to stay home and watch football because, as I said, I fell in love with the game in junior high. It really is a game of chess. It's far more cerebral than many people know or, give thought to its intellectual nature. It's a game of matchups. How does your pass rush match up against my pass protection? How do your corners match up against my receivers? How do my linebackers match up against your running game? What do we have to do to maximize my 11 against your 11, to cover up for weaknesses in my 11 against your 11? And it's a game of chess played by very strong, very fast, very powerful men, or to use the chess analogy, chess pieces. Fell in love with the game when I was in junior high, ended up in college. I'm from Los Angeles, grew up in Los Angeles, was in college at UC Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, and the Raiders were at the time in Oakland, which really was just down the road. And I fell in love with everything about the team. Look, man, in kindergarten, I was labeled a behavior problem. And that label stuck with me through high school, and many people would argue it is still with me today. I think it stuck with me throughout my years with the Raiders. Heck, I'm probably still a behavioral problem, but we should never label kindergartners. Let's just put that aside for a minute. Well, here's this team down the road owned by a gentleman, Al Davis, who didn't care if you were a behavior problem. If you could play, he wanted you on his team, and you could have been labeled a behavior problem by another team or teams. It didn't matter to Al. Come on here. I don't care what you wear. I don't care what you look like. I care what you do as a teammate. I care what you do as part of this organization. And I love that. And I remember watching the Raiders, and, back then you'd see other teams on the road for games getting off the buses, and they'd be in suits and ties. And then you'd see the Raiders stumble off the bus just looking like the cat just dragged them in. And I loved that. And I loved everything about the way Al gave first and second and third and fourth and sometimes more chances than people thought he should. I had been given extra chances when I didn't do well, and I just fell in love with the Raiders. So when I came back down to Los Angeles for grad school, that was my first call for an internship.
I think that's an Oakland thing. That's how the Oakland A's do it too. Every minor league team says you have to shave except the A's. They all have crazy big beards. It's an Oakland thing.
And why would you need to shave? Right?
Oh, you don't. It's a ridiculous thing. So I always grew a mustache, a ridiculous, terrible mustache.
You did grow a ridiculous looking mustache.
Because that's all they allowed. I love it. So CEO of the Raiders, what does that entail? What was your day-to-day like? How much were you involved in team building stuff or just setting the culture? What does CEO entail when that was your job?
Well, it's different at each of the 32 teams. A lot of times people say, well, what with any given topic, what does the NFL do, or how does it work in the NFL? Well, the NFL is a collection of 32 teams, and each of those 32 teams does things differently. So let me let you in on a little secret, men. The gentleman for whom I worked, Al Davis, he was very, very involved in our football operations. I don't know if you know that.
Breaking news here on the PFF NFL Podcast.
Breaking news. So really, Al, I remember a time when we were struggling as an organization. It was towards the end of Al's life, and there was a billboard that I drove under every day on the way home, and it said, Al, you've got to hire a GM. And I thought to myself every time I drove under it, they don't understand. He is the GM. And I don't mean they don't understand. Of course they understood, but my as I'm driving under the billboard was, he is the GM. And you know what? That was his right to do. And he ran the football operations. He oversaw the football operations. The man is in the Hall of Fame as a football man. So my responsibility skewed to the business side, finance, banking, business operations, marketing, community relationships, everything non-football. Al was very involved in that as well, though. There were times where people would say, well, Al's not going to be interested in whatever we do in such and such a business area. And I thought to myself, oh, yeah, he'll be interested, and he'll have a few things to say about everything, as well he should as the owner of the business.
So if he was making all the decisions, which he was a little hands-on, right? How much information did he take in? Did he like having information? Did he like his scouts' opinions? Was he on the road checking out prospects on his own? How did he go about making those final calls?
That's a great question. And by the way, I want to make very clear, I'm not criticizing him or throwing any shade, so to speak, by saying ultimately all the decisions were his, because the fact of the matter is, when you own a business, you have ultimate authority and ultimate responsibility. And even those team owners that delegate authority and delegate responsibility have the ability to yank that back at any moment, proving the point that ultimately, ultimate authority and ultimate responsibility rest with ownership. Some just choose to be more involved on a day-to-day basis than others, and that is their right. As to your question, he loved information. He didn't always follow advice that was given. It's a nice way of putting it. But he loved information. And if you could bring him information which made sense and which was valuable, he was going to listen. Ultimately, he would make the decision he would make, but he loved information.
Do you think that John Gruden is the guy to bring the Raiders back to the promised land? Almost, 20 years almost since he almost did it the first time?
Look, John is a good coach, and the team seems to be headed in the right direction. They've added some very, very good pieces. There's still some more pieces that are needed, but you know what? You could say that with respect to any team. No team has every single spot filled precisely as it would wish to have them filled. I think that the addition of Mike Mayock was tremendous to the team as well. I mean, look, obviously, and it's clear to everyone, John has ultimate authority, and Mike even acknowledged that when he took the job. John is running that operation. He's running that organization. And Mike noted when he took the job, look, I get it. John has final say, but it is my job to bring John all the information, all the options, and all the possibilities, understanding that at the end of the day, he'll make whatever choice he can. All of that said, I think Mike is bringing tremendous things to that organization, and it appears to be a good combination. As to that final hurdle, Kansas City has that division well in hand again this year.
Yeah.
The Raiders are absolutely in the thick of things for a wild card. Big game coming up against Indianapolis. And there's some other, obviously, all important games to be played by all of the teams ultimately vying for those wild card spots.
So we've talked a little bit about information and decision making and all that stuff. What are your thoughts on the general, what they're calling the analytics movement, right? There's more information than ever. But football's always been a game of information, right? And, playing the odds and all that stuff. What are your thoughts on just having more information and how it's infiltrated football?
Information is great. Why wouldn't someone making a decision want all information available? All the information that's possibly available, grab it and take that information and do with it as you wish in terms of balancing it. Look, analytics are a tool. If I go out to build a building, I'm going to look at every tool in my toolbox to see how best I can build that building. If I'm building a building, a house, an office building, whatever I'm building, I don't want a toolbox that just has a hammer or just has a screwdriver or just has a saw. I want every single tool imaginable in my toolbox. And then I'm going to use those tools as best I can in each and every opportunity or instance. So analytics are a tool. Of course you should avail yourself of every tool. And then what will distinguish people is how they choose to use different tools at different times.
So along the same lines there, what is the best way to convey some of these messages? Because some of the analytics that are being created here are, I'm not a math nerd. Sam's not a math nerd, but we work with some. I mean, we're talking people that are doing intense mathematical work and, crazy charts and graphs are coming out of it. How do you get, say, the best, most advanced analytical work from a machine to conveying a message to an Al Davis, a Bill Belichick, or John Gruden, whoever has to go and make that final decision? How do you handle the messaging? Do you have any ideas on that strategically?
Sure. I think the messaging is to present it as, here is information. You can use this information to help guide your decision. And then explain what the information is. I don't think it should be presented as, you must follow this, or this is an absolute, because you're going to alienate some people when you present something as an absolute, that it must absolutely, unequivocally be used. Present it as, just as I said, a tool. Look, here's this information. Here's what we found out. Let's see how we can use this to help with decision making. I would not present it as an, it must be, it's always going to be right, it's absolute. It is a tool. And there are some people who will feel it is a tool that should be leaned on or used more heavily than other tools. There will be others who say, yep, it's a tool and I'm going to factor it into my analysis and I'm going to factor it into my decision. But you know what? I'm going to factor other things into my decision as well. What do I say? You know, look, let's say the analytics tell you on a certain play, you must do X, whatever X is. But you're the head coach and you're on the sideline and you realize that doing X involves using players A, B, and C. And you noted that player C is struggling a little bit, or you noted that the weather is such that player B is having a lot of trouble, or you've noticed other things about the mood of the team or the tone of the game or, you know, the condition of the field. Well, you know what? It's okay to factor that in too. I would present it as something that can be helpful, but not as something that is absolutely unequivocally the only answer.
I think that's a great point. That's the kind of tone we've tried to talk about before on the podcast. All right, so we've done the hardcore analytics, the serious questions. Let's pivot to something a little less serious. There's billions of people on Twitter. Everybody uses it, and you are one of the few individuals I can think of that has their own personal shtick. The high thing, where did that come from? Particularly
not a shtick, but go on, and then we'll get
particularly
back. Not
because
a shtick. It's just me.
Stop making her mad.
Particularly because I didn't realize that there were multiple varieties. I didn't realize there was a more aggressive or a passive aggressive variety of high as well. I thought they were just all happy-go-lucky highs.
Oh, they really are on Twitter. It's when I do sometimes deliver one in person.
Okay.
You take a little bit of a tone. All right, let me tell you the background. It is not a shtick. It's me being me. I have always loved saying hi to people, and I've done it for as long as I can remember. I walk by someone on the street and we're passing one another. I say hi. I get into an elevator. There's people in the elevator. I say hi. I'm walking through a hotel lobby. I pass by someone. I say hi. Why wouldn't you say hi to someone that you walk by? Now, again, these are the olden days when we all used to be in elevators without masks and things like that, but
right.
You can still say hi through a mask. So I love saying hi in real life. So I like saying hi on Twitter. Why wouldn't we say hi to someone? Let me tell you something I love about Twitter. We have the ability to interact with others throughout the entire world in real time. And we have the ability to have conversations and exchange thoughts and ideas and communicate with others throughout the world. Do I think it's okay to disagree? Absolutely, positively. But you can disagree agreeably. And something we do in our Twitter village is we exchange thoughts in a reasoned and reasonable manner. And when we disagree agreeably. And I say hi. So now we all say hi a lot. And I will tell you, men, in the few years I've been on Twitter, I can count on probably two hands the numbers of times someone has been really, really nasty in expressing disagreement. And in each of those instances, I have written back and said, you know what, fair enough. You disagree with me. That's fine. You don't have to be mean when you disagree. And of course, I sound like a 3-year-old saying, don't be mean to me, but or a 7-year-old. I say, you don't have to be mean or nasty when you disagree. And less than one hand, the number of times that someone hasn't written back and said, you know what, you're right. I do disagree with you, but I didn't have to share it in a mean or nasty manner. Let's disagree agreeably. Well, think about what the world would be like if we all agreed that we would disagree agreeably and try to communicate to solve problems. And if Twitter allows us to do that, even on a teeny weeny basis, well then yay, Twitter.
Yeah, you have a phenomenally positive outlook on Twitter compared with the experience that I think...
It's because she sets the tone.
Right, that you and I have, and I'm choosing not to investigate what that says about us and how we behave on Twitter. I suspect that
She's
lies
fostered that environment.
the
Learn
root
something.
cause of all this. The other thing...
and I'm sorry, but I do call people out. If you're going to be mean, I'm going to call you out and say, why do you need to be mean when you're telling me you disagree? Go ahead, disagree with me, but you don't have to be a jerk about it.
And speaking of disagreement, Steve, Amy didn't think that Gregg Williams' zero blitz was a good idea, like you seem to.
Well, I mean, it wasn't as egregious as people said. Amy, your thoughts on the all-out blitz?
I just got so upset. I knocked the earpiece out. I tugged my hat over my.
Now we're going to disagree agreeably.
But we're going to disagree agreeably, and we're going to have an intellectual discussion about it. I thought that was one of the most absurd, insane, I won't say incomprehensible decisions, because it was Gregg Williams, so it was perfectly comprehensible.
Right.
Look, let's get to a few things about it. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, you've got me at a loss for words. I am so het up. But I will say that
that's how bad your take is, Steve.
Well, because here's something I will factor into it. And again, this is your analytics versus personnel and other issues coming together. I don't like the call under any circumstances in that particular situation at all. But now let's add to it that you left out on an island an undrafted rookie free agent, asking him to cover in that instance. Now, first of all, I don't like the call as a whole, but to do that to that player is not fair to the player, is not fair to the team. And by the way, and I realize this is a little bit of an aside from what you asked, I recall an experience with the Raiders where we left someone out on a corner like that, and it affected his confidence on a going forward basis for the rest of his career. I hope that is not the case with this player, but I digress. I thought that was the most idiotic defensive call imaginable in that circumstance. And yes, I'm happy for Raiders fans. I love you, Raiders fans. But as I tweeted immediately after that play, if I were the Jets owner, I would have at that moment told Gregg Williams, don't come back to the office.
Which they essentially did.
Yeah, which they listened to.
Took him a day, though.
My only take on it, the fact that I didn't think it was as egregious. If you do go through Gregg Williams' history, there is evidence of that particular similar play call. There's no exact perfect situation, but plays inside the 40, touchdown or not, or bust, where he's finished the game with sacks and with rushed passes and stuff like that. And I think the execution of the play wasn't great. And I'm not blaming Lamar Jackson, who was on the island. Even just like an add-on blitzer that should have been added there. I think Gregg Williams, the previous play he played coverage, I think he was viewing it as, this is how Derek Carr is handling the blitz today. This is how he's handling pressure. I'm going to make him get the ball out of his hands. He had been horrible to that point in the game. I don't think it was just like, just dial it up, just go. I'm Gregg Williams. I'm going to blitz you like crazy. I think there was at least a little thought put behind it.
Fair enough. And we are disagreeing agreeably. I almost said Oakland. I would have had to put $1 in my little jar. Las Vegas does have very, very, very good offensive line. And so notwithstanding your point, which is fair about some troubles that they'd been having that day with protecting and how Carr was performing, that is a very, very good offensive line. And they knew it was the last play of the game, and they knew they had to give Carr a chance. You could have sent one less man. You could have left someone deep just to protect the backside.
True.
You could have played sticks. You could have watched the sideline to make sure no one got out of bounds. I mean, there were umpteen things you could do. If you're going to do what Gregg Williams did, you can't fail.
It better work.
Because you cost your team that game.
Yeah. Look, I don't disagree with that. I mostly disagree with the people who think it was like a tank job from above. That's the part that's the part that I've somewhat facetiously pushed back on, and that it's in Gregg Williams' nature. He's done it before. He's had success, and there's at least some sound reasoning in there. I wouldn't make the play call. I wouldn't want to make the play call. I don't, it is risky, but I just don't think it's like a tank from the top.
Okay, I agree. I absolutely unequivocally agree with you. Period, full stop. I disagree with you on the play call. I think it was the stupidest play call known to mankind. Well, that might be a little bit of an overstatement. Stupidest play call possible in that situation. But I agree with you entirely. There was no tanking involved. There was no call from upstairs, no direction from anyone in the organization. Players don't tank. Coaches don't tank. In my experience in almost 30 years in the league, I never, ever, ever once heard of anyone in any organization suggesting that there should be a tank. That's not the way sports is. That's not the way the NFL is done. And by the way, anybody who watched the Jets celebrating on certain plays and who watched them after that play, there was no tanking involved.
I know you have to go really quick. My wife agrees with you, right? Because she said, if you teach a team to lose, how are you ever going to get them back? How are you ever, once you do get your quarterback or whatever, how are you ever going to get them back? Do you agree with that as just like, it's building a culture, right?
Well, it's just anybody who's been part of or knows anything about sports knows athletes don't, it's just, that's not what happens in the NFL. So,
and their jobs are on the line as they're doing this.
Right. Wise wife.
Yes, she's pretty smart. So this was one of our favorite, maybe our most favorite interview. Don't tell Steve Smith. Amy Trask, CBS sports
totally
analyst.
Telling Steve Smith.
Do not tell Steve. He was absolutely our favorite. I do not let, he can't get mad at me. Former CEO of the Raiders, author of You Negotiate Like a Girl, Reflections on a Career in the National Football League. Thank you, Amy, so much for this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. And I'm sorry I carried on at length on some things. You are fun to talk to. I could have gone on for hours.
Well, we'll have to have you back maybe sometime this offseason.
Deal.
All right. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks for watching the PFF YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe, all you have to do is push the button. Don't forget everything you get. A little fantasy, push the button. A little green line for the gambling aspects of the game, push the button. College football, push the button. The YouTube channel from PFF.